Okay, now the topic of the talk, which is nutrition. I'm going to talk about what we can do before calving and what we can do after calving. This is an interesting study conducted at UBC in Canada, in British Columbia. What you're seeing here is primary intake of cows that were tracked before calving and after calving, and they were categorized based on if they were healthy after calving, or they had a mildly metritic case, or they had a severe metritis case. If you look at the numbers of intake, they don't make a lot of sense. They have intakes of 16 kilos before calving and about 16 kilos after calving. The numbers look goofy, but it doesn't matter. If you look at the relative change between those three groups of animals, it's what matters. And you'll see that the cows that are healthy after calving, before calving, they were eating more. The animals that after calving had a case of metritis that was mild, they were eating a little bit less than the healthy cows. And the cows that after calving had a metritis, before calving, they already were eating also less. So we don't know what's going on. We don't know if these cows, they knew they were going to get metritis and they were eating less, or they get metritis because they were eating less before calving. We don't know what's going on. But we know that there is an association, and we know there are some signs that can lead us to believe that this cow will be having trouble right after calving. In any case, I think this is a good evidence that whatever we do pre-calving in terms of nutrition might have some positive consequences or negative ones after calving. Another example of the effects of nutrition pre-partum and reproduction after calving is this study from Castro et al. In 2012. This is ovulatory cows in black, and then you have anovulatory cows. And what is the difference between these two groups of cows? Well, cows that were anovulatory after calving were cows that at some periods before calving, their energy balance was negative. Okay? They were consuming less energy than what they actually needed. So, based on this evidence, some researchers, Graham et al. From Wisconsin and Nicolas Regent from Indra in France, have proposed to feed fat before calving. Why fat? Well, because fat is a very high density nutrient in terms of energy, provides lots of energy per kilogram of feed. And the aim of that, and the rationale of feeding fat before calving, is that we provide lots of energy so we prevent this negative energy balance before calving. Does that work? That was a proposal. Then there are some studies that have followed that up, and this is the result from Lowe et al. In 2011. Actually, it doesn't work. Okay, so that's something that I would definitely not recommend, to feed fat to a dry cow. This is what happens if you do that. If you feed high energy based on fat supply in the dry cow period, after calving, this is week of lactation, regardless of whether the animal is a primiparous cow or a multiparous animal, you're going to have elevated NEFA, non-esterified fatty acids in blood, which is not desirable. It's a sign of ketosis and reproductive problems later on. Okay, so do not feed fat before calving. What are the current recommendations from the NRC 2001 that almost everyone is using? The NRC 2001 recommends that during the close-up, that is the last 3 weeks of pregnancy, cows are exposed to a ration that's high in energy, 165 megacalories per kilo, lots of carbohydrates, 38% NFC, and not much fiber, 35% NDF. That's very similar to a ration of a lactating animal. Okay, and that's the current recommendations. And those are derived basically from studies conducted in the late 90s that show that if you were feeding this type of diets, after calving you would have lower NEFA blood concentrations. Does that make sense, though? And that's something that I really invite you to do in many areas of dairy production. We are, I don't know if it's veterinarians or agronomists, but we tend to be a little critical to what we do, okay? And I'll show you a couple of examples where we should be critical. There is one, and the reasons why this is proposed in the NRC and in the field are 3 reasons. One is, well, we need to avoid negative energy balance before calving. The other reason is, by providing this diet high in energy, I'm going to foster the growth of rumen papillae, which I'll need them after calving. And by providing this high NFC, I'm also going to adapt my rumen microbial microflora, so she's going to be ready, or that population of microbes will be ready to digest the diet of the lactating animal. Those are the 3 reasons why we're feeding this type of diets. Now I'm going to be critical about this. And the first criticism is, well, why should I feed that much energy? How much energy does a dry cow need, even at the last stage of lactation? This is how much a dry cow animal needs. 15 megacalories of energy per day, okay? So if I'm feeding a diet that's 1.65 megacalories per kilo, as the NRC 2001 recommends, how much dry matter a dry cow will consume? Our hosting cows are eaters. I mean, they eat a lot. They will eat at least 12.5 kilos. So what's going to happen if a dry cow, in front of their feed bank, she has a diet that's 165 megacalories per kilo, she will consume 12.5. 12.5 times 165 is 20.6. So at the end of the day, she will consume 20.6 megacalories. How much the cow needs? 15 megacalories. Why are we supplying more energy than what she needs? Our focus is to prevent energy deficiency, but we don't want an energy surplus. Energy cannot be created nor destroyed, just transformed. So the only way that this extra energy can go is not to milk, because the cow is dry, either the liver or the body fat reserves. Something that probably I don't want that from happening. For those of you that are not familiar with energy units, the difference between 15 and 20.6 megacalories is equivalent to about 8 liters of milk, or 10 liters of milk, okay? So where those 10 liters of milk need to go? Body fat. If you feed a very low energy diet, high in fiber, with lots of straw or grass hay, only 1.32, the cow will continue to eat 12.5 kilos, and she's going to consume 16.5. So we're still above the requirements of energy that that animal needs. So don't be worried. You can feed very low energy diets. The cow will come up with good intakes, and she will supply her needs of energy. This is studies from Illinois, from actually the Jim Strackley's group. They look at triglycerides, or the fat content in the liver, of animals that were receiving a high energy diet pre-calving or a low energy diet pre-calving. And animals with a high energy diet had almost 4-fold increase in fat deposition in the liver compared to dry cows that were offered just a single dry cow ration during the entire dry period, so no close-up diet. If we look at beta-hydroxybutyrate in blood, the same thing. Cows that were on a high energy diet before calving had a greater BHB concentrations in blood after calving. And this is intake. What these authors did is, again, is Jim's group. They came up with 3 groups of animals. They had what they call the overfed, following the NRC recommendations, high energy diet. Then they had a high forage, low energy diet, 1.32 megacalories, a typical dry cow diet. And then they had the same diet as the overfed, so 1.65 megacalories of energy, but it was restricted to only 7 kilos per day, or about 1% of body weight of those animals. So it was a very high energy diet in terms of density, but the volume of feed that was presented or available for the cows to eat was restricted. So in other words, the amount of energy that these animals were consuming was the same in the yellow than in the green treatment. This is weeks relative to calving, so 0 is calving date. And overfed animals, animals that are presented with a high energy diet, as calving approaches, intake goes down. This is one of the reasons that the NRC says, well, you need to feed a high energy diet before calving, because as calving approaches, the cow loses appetite and she consumes less. So if you want to avoid a negative energy balance, you have to increase nutrient density. And that's actually what happens. However, interestingly, when cows are offered a diet that's low in energy, there is no decline in feed intake as the cow approaches calving, okay? Feed intake is regulated by bulk, so the capacity of animal to consume, but also by energy demand. When the animals are producing lots of milk, intake will go up from 12 to 27 or 30 kilos, and that's energy driven. The same thing happens here. The cow is producing colostrum, is nourishing the fetus, she needs energy, so she's going to come up with ways of obtaining that energy by maintaining feed intake. Of course, these poor cows here that were restricted, they only had 7 kilos to eat. They ate everything 10 weeks before calving, and they ate everything 2 weeks before calving, so intake did not go down. What happens after calving? Well, interestingly, the cows that were on a high energy diet were the cows that started the lactation with the lowest feed consumption. And that's gonna be probably the reason why these cows have a greater BHBA and NEFA concentration in blood. Cows that were offered a low energy diet before calving or a restricted diet with high energy density, they started the lactation with the greatest intake. What this study indicates is that it's not the amount of feed that the cow consumes before calving what dictates how much feed she's going to eat after calving, but it's the slope of the decay of intake what marks how much the animal will eat afterwards. So if the slope is very steep, as calving approaches, intake will be low after calving. So as a nutritionist, my aim is to keep my intakes steady throughout my dry period. And that can be accomplished with a low energy diet, high in fiber. This is a study again from Jim's group. There have been some debates on the effects of these diets in terms of long term. What happens, people are still not really convinced that this is the case. This was a small study. So what these researchers have done is done a meta-analysis. They've combined data from 7 different studies, I believe. And they looked at intake after calving based on the type of diet, whether a control energy, that would be low energy diet, or a high energy, far off, that would be the first month of dry period, or close up, the last month of the dry period. So if they're in the far off, you offer high energy diet, your intakes after calving will be low, much lower than if you were feeding a low energy diet than in the far off dry period. Then in the close up, there are basically no differences, but again, numerically, if you feed a low energy diet, you're gonna have numerically greater intakes than a high energy diet. Although the message here is that you're not gonna affect intakes by feeding a high or controlled energy diet, because so you don't have to be concerned about compromising your future ability of the cows to consume feed if you're feeding a controlled energy diet before calving. This is also from the meta-analysis, so it's a combination of 6 or 7 studies. Blood concentrations of NEFA, non-esterified fatty acids, which is a reflection of how much fat the animal is mobilizing from her body, relative to calving, so -2, -1, first week of calving, 2 and 3, and animals that were on a high energy, supposedly aimed at reducing negative energy balance, had a greater NEFA blood concentrations than cows that were fed on low energy diets before calving. So I think that summarizes it, and I would recommend to feed low energy diets before calving.